I would like to welcome everybody to this ICAHD UK webinar. And we welcome the very large audience that we have with many countries represented this evening. ICAHD UK represents ICAHD in Jerusalem. We're now in our 21st year. We are very involved in education and awareness raising, lobbying in Parliament, participating in campaigns, working with other organizations on this issue. We've supported ICAHD itself in many ways, including participation in the ICAHD rebuilding camps. ICAHD has constructed 190 Palestinian homes as acts of nonviolent political resistance to Israel's demolition policy. We're also involved in providing issue-based study tours that go to Palestine, Israel. Well, since ICAHD's founding in 1997, it has also looked at the big picture, working for a just and sustainable peace for all the people in that locality. And we're now at a crossroads in what's happening. Therefore, the theme of today's webinar is Global Palestine. What is happening to the Middle East and where are we headed? Today's webinar is being led by Dr. Jeff Halper, Director of ICAHD. Jeff is an anthropologist, former professor at Friends World College. He's an activist, author, and one of the co-founders of the One Democratic State campaign led by Palestinians. Currently, Jeff is also a member of the International People's Tribunal on Gaza. Much could be said about Jeff, but right now I'm going to hand over to Jeff to proceed into the webinar. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Linda, for that. Welcome, everyone, to another ICAHD webinar. Excuse the hat. I had a little minor medical procedure that I don't have to share with you all, and so I'm wearing the hat. It's kind of a cool hat anyway, I think. So, I mean, if anything is timely, certainly this webinar to talk about where are we in the Middle East and where are we headed as a region is certainly that one. After all the dramatic events that have happened with Iran and, of course, the ongoing tragedy of Gaza and all kinds of other issues that we'll talk about tonight. Tonight we have really two outstanding analysts, friends of mine, but people that I've read for many years, and people who I've met at other conferences, Mouin and Abed, and I'd like to structure this a little bit more as more of a conversation of really getting into the issues rather than merely questions and answers. I think we'll begin with Mouin. Mouin Rabbani is a co-editor of Jadalia and a contributing editor to the Middle East Report. He's also the managing editor of the Journal of Peace Building and Development and a fellow at the Democracy for the Arab World Now, or DAWN, organization. Mouin is a very well-known analyst. He writes a lot, both in popular, but also in more academic and political venues as well. He's a Dutch Palestinian analyst. Really, I mean, together, I think with Abed, one of the analysts that I really think are among the most serious that are out there, that I really learned. They're both thinkers, and I can't think of a better introduction and compliment to someone than simply to say they're thinkers. So let's begin with Mouin, and then we'll turn to Abed in a second. And Mouin, you know, the emphasis is a little bit on the big picture, trying to put, there are so many things that have been happening on all kinds of levels in the Middle East and affecting the Middle East, that, you know, my feeling is, and this is one of the thoughts behind this webinar, was people can sometimes lose the forest for the trees. especially because many of the people involved in this issue are activists. And so, they often tend to sort of run after the latest thing that's happening or the most dramatic thing that's happening. And we lose, I think we lose the big picture. We lose sometimes our senses of priority, of where we should be campaigning. And certainly, I think we have to really strengthen the connection between the activism working on behalf of the Palestinians and the peoples of the region, and which requires an analysis and activism itself that has always the danger of being reactive. And so I think this is the sort of the attempt to address a more activist audience, but with people like you, Mouin, and Abed, that can provide that wider context, that bigger picture. So Mouin, let's start with you as a political analyst and sort of look at, if you could share your thoughts at the beginning, kind of about the political trajectory that the region is going on. We're looking more, well, obviously with Palestine, but Palestine within the context of the wider region. Um, and to look at the political trajectory. Certainly, normalization, the Trump-sponsored idea of normalization and the Abraham Accords is crucial to this story. It's not something that we're focused on very much, I think. Um, Maybe the idea of pacification of the Palestinians as a precondition for normalization can explain what's happening to some degree in Gaza and the West Bank. The idea of that after Iran and its proxies have been neutralized, in a sense, the emergence of almost a co-hegemonic relationship between Israel on the military side and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and maybe Qatar on the economic side. In other words, all kinds of things, the strengthening of the very hyper neoliberal autocratic states in the region, what's happening to the peoples of the region, not only the Palestinians, but the peoples in general. So to try to relate to some of those issues and specifically, does what's happening in Gaza change the equation in any way in terms of this trajectory? How did Iran influence things? What about the BRICS bloc that's supposed to be the counter bloc to the to NATO and the global West? Those are some of the questions. If you just look at the big trajectory for a minute, share your thoughts with us. That would be great.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And allow me to begin by thanking the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions for organizing this and inviting me to participate. I've followed and admired the work of ICAHD and also that of you personally, Jeff, for many years. So it's an honor to be here. I think I would start by answering your question to look at the trajectory that existed on October 6th, 2023. And that was one where the United States was pushing for a process of Arab-Israeli normalization in order to remove the prospect of further conflict in the Middle East, in the sense that this was a process designed to marginalize the Palestinians and ultimately give Israel the capacity to resolve the question of Palestine unilaterally on its own terms, on the one hand, and secondly, to ensure the further weakening and isolation of Iran, which this project believed would also lead to the weakening and isolation of its various coalition partners in the region. And I believe that this can be seen as part of the so-called pivot to Asia. Not that the United States was ever going to leave the Middle East or plan to leave the Middle East, but it wanted a much more manageable Middle East that required a lot less direct U.S. involvement, a little along the lines of the subcontracting of the region to regional policemen that we saw with the so-called Nixon Doctrine in the 1970s. And I think the Palestinian attacks of October 7th changed all that because it had several consequential ramifications. The first was that it demonstrated irrevocably, I think, the failure of this approach where rather than Arab Israeli normalization being the outcome of or the result of Palestinian self-determination, and instead using it to eliminate the Palestine question, that approach failed in a very visible way. Secondly, you then began to see elements of the self-proclaimed axis of resistance mobilizing not only in solidarity with the Palestinians, but also against the U.S. Presence in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq and Syria. And thirdly, I think it caused a significant change in Israel's security doctrine, which prior to that had been one of possessing overwhelming force as a deterrent against any attack on Israel and using it periodically to conduct what Israel terms mowing the lawn. The failure of that approach, I think, caused also a change in Israel's security doctrine, where henceforth it felt the need to confront, eliminate, and eradicate any real potential or emerging threat to its national security anywhere in the Middle East. And I think we saw this most clearly with a very widespread Israeli offensive against Syrian military capabilities throughout the country immediately after the ouster of the Assad regime in December of last year. Now you have the Trump administration in power, the second Trump administration, and it is, of course, in my view, a lot less ideologically committed to kind of the pillars of traditional U.S. Middle East policy than its predecessors, and particularly the Biden administration. And you had this during the first Trump administration, you had this very clear meeting of minds between the United States, Israel, and conservative Arab states about renouncing the Iranian nuclear agreement, about maximum pressure on Iran, about seeking to weaken and isolate Iran with an aspiration of regime change in Tehran. By the entry of the second Trump administration, that had changed primarily because the conservative Arab states, although they would have very much liked to see this agenda succeed, had come to the conclusion that the costs of doing so would be prohibitively high. This is a result of the Iranian drone and missile attack on the key Aramco oil facilities in 2019, and the ability of Ansar Allah, the Houthis, to regularly launch drones and missiles into Saudi territory and even Emirati territory during the last decade. So these states were, in fact, encouraging the United States to pursue a diplomatic resolution with Iran. Iran was amenable to it because it desperately needed sanctions relief. And the United States, I believe, the Trump administration, in my view, did not enter office with a predetermined intention of getting into an armed conflict with Iran. I don't think the negotiations, at least not initially, were a ruse to lull the Iranians into a false sense of security in order to attack them. And I think this put Israel into a dilemma. For Israel, a diplomatic resolution is the worst outcome. And a resolution that allows the U.S. to significantly reduce its direct involvement and footprint in the Middle East and shift to other priorities is an even worse outcome as far as Israel is concerned. And we saw that, for example, with the intensive Israeli lobbying, not only to maintain sanctions on Syria, but to maintain U.S. Forces in Syria. And if we look at the developments of the past several weeks, particularly with the war in Iran, I think they're quite telling about the direction of travel. Yes, the United States did authorize and support an Israeli attack on Iran, but in my view, it did so primarily because Trump and Witkoff, neither of whom are the stable geniuses they proclaim themselves to be, um, did so on the understanding that what Israel was doing was improving Washington's negotiating position vis-a-vis Iran, rather than pursuing a policy of regime change. And if you look at the US bombings of Iran, they were very directed at specific targets rather than a widespread campaign intended to promote the fall of the Islamic Republic regime in Iran. And so, therefore, in my view, the United States still has a policy of seeking to, um, sure, to control the Middle East, but by reducing its involvement, and is looking at the Middle East now primarily as a source of revenue and investments in order to improve the US economy and in order to maintain US economic global dominance. In other words, I believe its Middle East policy is much more about China than it is about Israel. And that, I think, also explains the growing links that we're seeing now between the United States on the one hand and particularly the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Qatar on the other. Now, the question becomes, is the Middle East, as it was during the Cold War, going to become an arena for rivalry between the global powers, between the United States, Russia, and China? I don't believe that's going to be the case for a simple reason. During the Cold War, the states in the region were clearly aligned with one bloc or with the other. What you see now, if you look, for example, at the states in the Middle East that are most closely aligned with the United States, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and so on, they have engaged in a process that I would call strategic diversification. In other words, their primary relationship may be with the United States, and they may look to Washington as the ultimate guarantor of their security and stability, but nevertheless, they've developed increasingly deep ties with both Russia and China based on their interests. Egypt imports a growing proportion of its weaponry from Russia. Saudi Arabia cooperates closely with Moscow to regulate global energy markets. China is the main purchaser of Gulf energy supplies and main trading partner of many of these states. So I don't see us going into a situation akin to what we had in the Cold War. That could, of course, change if Israel continues to pursue its new security doctrine, which will lead it to directly attack and seek to depose or overthrow governments such as that in Iran that are closely aligned with Russia and China. But the difference in the Middle East has always been that Israel's strategic partners appear to be much more committed to Israel than its adversaries' strategic partners are committed to them. So during the Cold War, for example, Soviet support of, for example, Egypt and Syria never matched U.S. support for Israel. So it's a situation in flux, and the most interesting question now is, are we seeing a genuine divergence of strategic interests gradually developing between the United States and Israel, or will the United States continue to look at Israel as its most reliable proxy to serve and promote its interests in the Middle East? Thank you.
Thank you, Mouin. That's a lot of food for thought that we're going to develop in a few minutes. Now I'd like to turn to Abed Takriti, our other speaker tonight. Um, uh, and Abed is an associate professor in modern Arab history at Rice University in Houston, although I think now, Abed, you're at the branch of Rice University in Paris. You could talk about that if you'd like. And he's the chair of the Arab American Educational Foundation for Arab Studies, having completed his doctorate at St. Anthony's College in Oxford, where he continues to work with Professor Kamran Abbousi, who many of us know as well, on a digital humanities project called the Palestinian Revolution. Abed is a historian, or at least the history part comes out very strongly, focusing on the history of revolutions, intellectual and political currents, and state building in the modern Arab world. In other words, a larger regional perspective, even though Abed himself is of Palestinian origin, having been born in Jordan. Abed also is in, I don't know if you all know about this. I mentioned it to him. He's in a great series on Jacobin Radio's The Dig, in which he's interviewed over a number of episodes by Daniel Denver. The series is called Favour, or Revolution, on the history of Arab revolutionary politics, with really an emphasis on Palestine. A very wide-ranging discussion, and Daniel is very good in terms of both bringing knowledge, but also eliciting great analyses from people like Abed, and I really recommend that for everyone. And I have to say that the Mouin also was interviewed this week, or this last week, by Daniel on The Dig. So The Dig is sort of a constant a little bit in these. And The Dig is this series Favour I really recommend to everybody. So if Mouin was talking about the political trajectory of the region, Abed, I'd like to turn to you about maybe giving us your thoughts on the historical trajectory of the region. In other words, from a century ago, just before until World War I, really a very coherent, integrated region, of Arab cultures, a lot of fluidity, and so on. And then, of course, in World War I, getting into the colonial, the imposed states, the British and French in the region, that kind of division, the rise of Islam, or the rise of Zionism, introducing another colonial aspect to everything. And then, moving into the so-called post-colonial eras when the British and French leave, in which you try to have a secular Arab nationalism. There's an aspiration of Arab unity. Again, a kind of a thought of the region as a region and so on, that gets to some degree destroyed in a way in 1967 by Israel with the fall of Nasser and Nasserism to some degree, and the rise of political Islam. And then, of course, the rise of oil and the oil kingdoms and so on. To this idea, maybe we should talk about it, of co-hegemony in the region between Israel and these conservative Arab states, and moving towards this normalization. So, I mean, I don't want to impose on you my framework of the trajectory, but give us a wider perspective in terms of where the Middle East was, maybe what the aspirations of the people were. Have those aspirations changed, or have the people been absolutely marginalized by these other larger forces? And just begin to give us a sense of where the region might be headed.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and I'm honored also to be hosted here at this very distinguished forum. And the work that you've done with ICAHD and that Linda has been doing for many years is really inspirational. You guys have played a key role in highlighting one of the worst crimes that are committed against the Palestinian people for many years, which is, of course, home demolitions. But through that also, you've been able to shed light on the overall disastrous situation that emanates out of the colonialism that has been unfolding in Palestine for a long time. I'm also honored to share this platform with my dear friend and very old friend, not old in age, but been friends for a very long time, Mouin. It's always a pleasure to listen to Mouin and to learn from him. As you mentioned, I'm gonna look at the more historical side of things. I mean, I think Mouin has done a very good job in talking about the contemporary dynamics, but I do think that they do have a very old history, a deep history behind them. And I'm gonna look at the structural aspects around it. I'm gonna first start by saying that the Middle East region was subjected to something quite unique in the modern era, which is the imposition of a very late settler colonialism at quite at a stage in time in history where settler colonial projects were not the biggest threat. There was a period when settler colonialism was spreading like wildfire everywhere across the world, but that came at an earlier period. The post-World War I period was not supposed to be a period in which lots of settler colonial projects were being set. And indeed, in this region, we've had two major settler colonial projects imposed. One was Algeria, and that came much earlier in the 19th century. And then the other one was Palestine, which of course came out of the end of the First World War. Yes, people talk about these early Zionist settlements in Palestine and so on, but really the project becomes meaningful and seriously harmful after Britain comes and adopts it and says it's our job to make sure that this gets implemented on the ground. This is very important to note, because what happens in situations like this, when you force a settler colonial project on a space, it means that you have an immediate contradiction with the local population on the ground. These are people that you have to remove. These are people that need to clear land for you. Also, you have a contradiction with the surrounding region, especially if the people that you are targeting and the land that you are targeting was politically integrated to a broader region, economically integrated to a broader region, socially integrated to a broader region. And that definitely applied to Palestine. And it's important to emphasize it. Sometimes people, especially in pro-Palestinian circles, are careful around that because they don't want to reinforce Zionist propaganda that there's no particularity to the Palestinian people. But the Palestinian people, yes, there is a particularity to them, of course, and they belong to Palestine, but they're also very closely intertwined with a broader region around them. That has always been the case. And that has both material aspects as well as political aspects, as well as cultural ones. That meant that if you're going to come and expel these people, oppress them, subject them to the worst measures imaginable, because these kind of projects require that. They require a great deal of not only oppression, but also what somebody like Herbert Marcuse would have called surplus repression, extra. Like it becomes like almost it becomes a purpose, a self-propelling process that cannot be stopped. This has been the experience in this region structurally from the minute Britain has entered the scene till now. And one of the features here is the Zionist project was never very popular amongst any of the surrounding states. In fact, one of the early Zionists that was entrusted with coordinating with Arab leaderships around and trying to cultivate relationships with them had noted in their memoirs that they had failed to find a single leader that was a genuine Zionist, like as in believed in the project. These are people that were talking to folks that became notoriously anti-Palestinian later on. People like the Ismail family, for example, others like that in Lebanon. Those guys were not Zionists. They were willing sometimes to cooperate with this project, but they had no great deal of enthusiasm for it because this requires a certain type of ideology that has no rooting in this region. And also, this is a very harmful project for the region. If you're in Lebanon, you know that you're going to end up having to absorb lots of Palestinian refugees if this project succeeds. Same goes for Jordan, same goes for other parts of the region. It means that you might end up in endless wars. The social cost is very heavy, the political cost is very heavy, the military cost is very heavy. It's extremely destabilizing. And that has been a feature of the politics of the region since this project was imposed. Now, I want to clarify a distinction here also for the benefit of our listeners, because sometimes, especially on the left, people confuse the two. They come and say, well, this project was necessary for imperialism to function. Actually, I beg to differ. Sometimes it was used for beneficial purposes by empires. However, imperialism typically actually functions much more smoothly when there's no settler colonial commitment. Because there is a difference between imperialism and settler colonialism. Settler colonists tend to actually have a great deal of autonomy from empire. And sometimes they operate on their own in ways that are harmful to empire. Most often, you find them clashing with empire at key moments, except when we're dealing with spaces like the Western Hemisphere, where you had an entire takeover on a continental scale, and later on, of course, contradictions do emerge between the imperial center and the settler colonial outposts. So in this part of the world, imperialism had actually taken over the whole region very early on, and it has never left. What you had was a period of contestation against it that lasted for a few decades. And you had times when certain key states, as a result of popular revolutions and popular mobilizations, were able to strike some kind of distance from the main imperial centers, which were previously, of course, Britain and France, and later on, the United States. But overall, this is a region that has not actually achieved a successful quest for sovereignty. It is one of the most heavily penetrated regions in the world by imperial power. And that would have been the case with Israel or without Israel. The most important part in the region strategically is a part that I studied very closely for many years, which is the Gulf. That had a very strong British hold on it, extremely strong. And it had a good transition plan for it right after the British left. There's an article that I wrote about that having to do with transition in the American Historical Reviews. It's called Colonial Coups and the War on Popular Sovereignty. The point in places like this was to ensure that there's no popular sovereignty, to ensure that there's an organic relationship between the rulers in the region and the main imperial power. And it's a codependent relationship that has very specific features to it, and that came about as a result of not decades, but 2 centuries of interaction. In the case of Britain, and a transition towards American power that was bumpy, but nevertheless pretty secure. And the most important, of course, state in the whole system on the Gulf side was Saudi Arabia. It had started actually the transition even before the British left the region. So it went American very early on. So that's the map that we're dealing with. The main problems and the main contestations that Israel had, that the settler colonial structure had regionally for many years, was between, of course, its primary contradiction was with the native population. That's actually it. As much as they try to claim that it's irrelevant, that it has no space, that it has no weight in the region, that it has no meaning, they keep saying the Palestinian cause is over, blah, blah, blah. Usually it's always a Zionist. Anybody that tells you, oh, the Palestinian cause is over, you should know that this is an ideological statement. A cause like this is not over until either the people disappear or their rights are restored. There's no possibility for it to be over otherwise. Now, the Zionist favored option is for the people to disappear. And there is a section of Zionism that whose favored option was for the people to be contained within a small geographic zone that has diminished sovereignty. And that option for many years was promoted worldwide under the banner of solutionism. Okay, whether they keep talking about solutions, either two-state, one-state, this, that, blah, blah, you know, to cover up the fact that actually there's no interest in a solution on the part of the Zionist movement. Not on the part of the, by the way, the so-called left, not on the part of the so-called right there. They're actually all united. The so-called left, when they talk of a Palestinian state, they never meant a Palestinian state. They didn't intend any form of real sovereignty. That's why they were expanding settlements. That's why they were pushing for all sorts of programs that ensured that this space never actually, even within the small constrained confines of 22% of Mandate Palestine, which was the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, they ensured that it never could be fully sovereign. And then, of course, you have a maximalist project on the other side that was opposed to the idea of any form of statehood, even a diminished one from the very beginning. So this is the world we're dealing with. That's the background to what we're talking about. The problem that Palestinians faced was that initially, the very state system, which was opposed to Zionism, that came out of the overthrow of British-affiliated regimes and colonial-affiliated regimes around Palestine, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, these countries were not able to wage a battle for liberation and not interested really because they were too small. Their sizes in the international system would not have allowed them to confront a state that had a guarantee from all the major global powers. Okay, so on the one hand, you have this historical dilemma. These states were making big banners saying, we're gonna, after the people were expelled by these very vicious settler colonists, and through arming by actually the two big superpowers. Always remember, the Soviet Union armed the Zionist movement when the moment came of lack of weapons, lack of equipment, serious demoralization in the 1948 war. They came and they brought in the Czech arms deal. It saved them. They came in at the UN, pushed for the partition resolution. By the way, partition resolution would have never happened in 47 had it not been for the Eastern Bloc. It would have been impossible. So this was the two big blocs coming in saying, as a fact, we're going to create a settler colonial state, deal with it. And we'll leave you some margin of maneuver over small pieces of territory that will be left later on. We'll say that, yeah, we want an Arab state there without defining what that means. Is it going to be Palestinian? Is it going to be under Jordan? Is it going to be under who? We're going to leave that vague. And of course, later on, the Palestinians have to fight, say, hi, we're here. Now, the Arab regional system initially was unable to say, I can't fight for this cause enough against this entire regional international order. And at the same time, it was unable and unwilling to say, let me ensure that the Palestinians are equipped with the necessary diplomatic, political, economic, and military armor that will allow them to carry out a very vigorous anti-colonial fight. And this became a dilemma that lasted until 1967. By 1967, the Arab states are pretty much out of the even formal fight. All the wars that have been fought since 48, they were actually defensive wars on the part of these states. They were not wars of liberation for Palestine. These were states that were trying to actually defend themselves against this new formation that had been imposed on the region against their will, and that was constantly hitting everything around it. Because it can only imagine a world in which it exists in this region through subjugating everybody in it. It does not have a theory of political existence in this space that does not entail total subjugation and total paramountcy in every level, economic, military. It can't imagine anything beyond that. And that's why every time you hear an Israeli commentator or a Western commentator, they always start with Israel has a right to defend itself. What they mean by that is Israel has to be dominant in this space. That's what they really mean by it. It means, in concrete terms, they have to be given more weapons, better weapons than everybody around it, total economic support, and diplomatic cover, no matter what they do. And we're seeing this today in its worst forms. They committed a genocide. They are committing a genocide. They're wanted by the entire international legal system. They're condemned by it. And still, you have the main key players, the great powers are saying, and the only superpower really, they're saying, okay, we're going to allow this to continue. So I think we have to look at the structural scene to understand that the Arab states were always too weak to be able to deal with that. They were trying to defend against that in the first wars that they had with the state. That was the case in 48. That was the case in 56. That was the case in 67. These were not offensive wars, including, by the way, the 48 war. It was imagined and conducted as a very defensive operation. And 73 was a limited operation to be like, we deserve a seat on the diplomatic table. The United States better talk with us and take us seriously so that we can initiate a negotiation over land that we lost. After 67, the main actual development is not only that the entirety of Palestine is occupied, but it's that, of course, the Israelis expand well beyond its borders. So this is the map. Now, two things happen around this time. First, Palestinians develop their own structures in this period. And that starts in the early 60s after the collapse of the United Arab Republic. There's a lot of pressure on Nasser to do something around Palestine. The Israeli state was acquiring nuclear weapons at the time. They were expanding their water project. They done the diversion of the Jordan River waters. It was a very serious, intense environment. His way out was, okay, I'll support creating a representative structure for Palestinian, the Palestine Liberation Organization. So that develops, and of course, with it develops the idea of independent military capacity for Palestinians, something that Nasser and the other Arab leaders did not want, but that the Palestinians imposed from their grassroots, sometimes making use of internal Arab contradictions to further that. So, they made use, for example, of a contradiction between Syria and Nasser to be able to get Syria to allow them to operate training bases at a certain period when, after the Ba'ath coup. And then, later on, they got some support from Algeria, they got some support from, and of course, not Algeria under Ben Bella, who was close to Nasser, Algeria under Boumediene after they had the divorce. Okay, so again, they had to deal with regional contradictions to be able to get some independent military capacity. In the post-73 era, all the features of the region that we see today were taking shape. And somebody like Arafat understood that. Because Palestinians, the ones that are sober, I'm not talking about people that don't know what's going on. And, I love people who are driven by passion and commitment. But there is something called the balance of power also around. And there were Palestinians in the 70s that understood what was going on. They saw what Syria was doing, that it was interested predominantly in expanding its influence in Lebanon and regaining its on occupied territories while exercising a great deal of hegemony over the Palestinian cause. That was its main objective. Okay, they saw that. But was there a plan to liberate Palestine from there? No. Was there a plan to liberate Palestine from Egypt? It's certainly not under Sadat. Even if Nasser would have wanted such a plan, and he did not actually have one. He declared that in 1962. But, certainly under Sadat, that was not the objective. They did not have the capacity, these states. The gift that came to Palestinians, and I'm going to end on this, Jeff, because we can go on and on. That's a problem with history. The replacement for the exit of these countries from the arena, especially Egypt, once it signs, something happens simultaneously in 1978. You have Egypt heading in that Camp David direction, and you have a major social revolution in Iran, the greatest social revolution of the last quarter of the 20th century, which produced, of course, the phenomena that we now know as the Islamic Republic. The Palestinian leadership at the time saw some hope in this revolution because they thought, okay, I've lost Egypt and I don't have pretty much anybody else reliable in this region. Maybe the counterbalance, the state that has some weight that might support me, will be a revolutionary Iran, certainly with the kind of overtures that was making at the time. And of course, Yasser Arafat invested heavily in that relationship during those years. By the way, when Khomeini came back to Tehran, in the PLO headquarters in Beirut, they made a cake looking like the Dome of the Rock. And they were like, next year in Jerusalem. And Yasser Arafat got into one of his enthusiastic modes. He was saying, I always felt that it was bound to be liberated a second time by a non-Arab. Of course, he was referring the first time to Salah ad-Din, who was a Kurd. And now he was saying, now a Farsi descended, a Persian, Ayatollah Khomeini might be the new liberator. So they put big hopes. Now, of course, those hopes crashed eventually over the first couple of years. There was a honeymoon back and forth. But by 81, there were serious tensions between Khomeini and Arafat. And of course, the Iran-Iraq war destroyed the potential for a close PLO alignment with Iran. So we have now the PLO having to deal with a very difficult situation like that, but we have a new player coming in that is talking about Palestine, even if they're not necessarily, like the rest of the Arab states, having a serious vision for its liberation. It's part of their agenda, by the way. It's not that they would be against that. But I don't think they ever thought that they have the capacity to fully do it. Okay. And the other side of the equation with Iran was that, of course, it had major ideological repercussions on the Palestinian scene. It caused a serious problem in the Muslim Brotherhood, which up till that point was a quietist political formation that had already had a major split in the 1950s. It was young Muslim brothers that actually established Fatah, by the way. So that was the first split from the Muslim Brotherhood. And they saw it as a big blow to them because the Muslim Brotherhood did not want to fight against Israel, did not want revolution, did not want any form of clash. This is, by the way, the group that is the mother of Hamas. Okay. Then we have another split coming in with the Iranian Revolution, which is Islamic Jihad. Lots of cadres from the Muslim Brotherhood, including from a stronghold Gaza, actually go and split as a result of the Iranian Revolution. They see promise in political Islam, even if it's in Iran, it's yes, Shia political Islam, but they're saying, okay, Islam is Islam, we can have a Sunni version. That becomes Islamic Jihad. So they're under pressure too to transform, become more active politically. Of course, there are many other regional things going on, Afghanistan, etc. But the map is redrawn out of this process. And the idea of how to confront the settler colonial project internally, ideologically within Palestine changes because you have now a section that has just discovered the idea of revolutionary fervor. This is the Islamists. These were the most quietest people, but suddenly they're like, oh, you can be a revolutionary too with this ideology. At the same time that the old revolutionaries were discovering political pragmatism. And they were like, we have to, wait a second, in our early years, we didn't understand that there are state interests and there are these bigger forces operating around us. We tried to transform them, but we hit a wall. So now our main objective is to get a seat at the table. So you have these two projects developing in the internal Palestinian arena. You have the complete fall of the Arab camp into the imperial domain, starting with Egypt, but later on, of course, the painful process that ended up absorbing Iraq and Syria eventually. And you have the rise of this new power, Iran. And I'm going to stop here because, again, the problem with history is that we get stuck in lots of details, and there's never enough time.
Okay, thank you, Abed, for that. We want to leave time for questions, but we have to follow up, with these two really important contributions. And Mouin, I'm sure you want to add something. Let me just put in one, just in my impression from listening to both of your presentations, is that in some ways it seems that that you're both sort of presenting a kind of a steady state situation that we're beginning. Everything seems to be moving towards the success of imperialism. After all, Western imperialism, after all these years, the Arab governments have either been co-opted or are weak or have become, these hegemonic forces regionally on their own, but allied with not only with the United States, but also with BRICS, so that you don't have a BRICS NATO or a North-South competition. Instead, they're coming, they have a working relationship. Like, Saudi Arabia is both an American client state, but it's also, it's a question. The BRICS say it's a part of BRICS, and Saudi Arabia says we're not yet, but certainly the Emirates are a part of that, and Egypt and so on. And Iran, it turns out, which gives some explanation to the Israeli attack, maybe, it comes out as the only real state in the region that has a pro-Palestinian, proactive agenda, rather than certainly than the Arab governments and so on. So in a way, it seems almost like all these forces and Zionism also in a sense has succeeded. You have the normalization process, the Abraham Accords are coming through, and normalization means normalizing with a greater Israel, and the Palestinians get locked into a Bantustan on maybe 15% of the country. So I guess my question is, am I misreading what you're saying? Because it's sort of a little bit of a depressing picture. But to move on from that just for a minute, what about, is there any opening for progressive forces? I mean, is this the end of the story? You know, Fukuyama's the end of history. We've reached a steady state. Everybody's managing and the progressive forces have been defeated and the liberation forces have been defeated and so on. Or is there an opening here? Where are the counter imperialist and pro-liberation, not only for Palestine, but for the forces that behind the Arab Springs in all the different countries? In other words, is there an exit from this steady state situation forward into something more progressive that would give more hope to the peoples? I don't know, Mouin, maybe you want to and say whatever else you want to add to.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Jeff. As I always do, I listened very carefully to Abed's fascinating presentation, and I thought one key point in what he said is, excuse me, that ultimately this is a struggle for popular sovereignty and meaningful national independence. And I was particularly interested in the discussion about Iran because Iran, as he mentioned, was the most consequential social popular revolution of the latter part of the 20th century and was then aborted by a combination of the war launched against it by Iraq shortly after the revolution succeeded. But to get back to your question, I think it's important to recognize that we're now in a time of transition. We're in a time of local, regional, and global transition. And that, I think, makes it difficult to give a clear and definitive response to your question, but it does, I think, allow for a number of observations. First of all, I'm not alone in having noted the quite low level of popular mobilization in the Arab world, even after 2 years of continuous live streamed genocide. Explanation for this is that Arab governments, not too long ago, experienced the decade of upheaval, um, uh, that's popularly known as the Arab Spring, and are therefore even more sensitive than they would be under normal circumstances to any form of popular mobilization within their societies because it's an attitude, I think, of you open the bottle and next thing you know, it's pouring all over the place. So I believe that Arab political leaders and their security forces have been much more sensitive about repressing any popular organization in support of the Palestinians. But that, I think, is going to have fundamental consequences over the medium and longer term. I do believe that the Gaza genocide does represent a kind of 1948 moment for the regional order. And what I mean by that is that in 1948, of course, you had the establishment of the State of Israel, the failed effort by the surrounding Arab states to intervene, and then over the following decade, you had a whole series of coups, revolutions, and uprisings in the Middle East. These were, of course, not exclusively a direct response to what happened in Palestine. Their primary motivations were, of course, local factors. But Palestine, I think, formed a crucial factor in unleashing this series of events in the Arab world during the 1950s. Now, one could argue that in the 1950s, Arabs were reacting to the failure of their leaders, their rulers, their regimes to confront the Nakba. Well, in the 2020s and 30s, they will not be dealing with the failure of their leaders. They will be failing with the refusal of their leaders to even try to do anything. And that, I think, could be more consequential. The second factor is if we look at the war that was just concluded, well, at least temporarily, between Israel and Iran. I think people will look at Iran, irrespective of their views about the Islamic Republic, and will say that here you had a state, no one came to support it. Its closest geopolitical allies did not feel motivated to come to its aid or resupply its anti-aircraft systems and so on. But it was able to remain standing and fighting until no less than the United States imposed a ceasefire. Well, if a state like Iran can do this, why are we sitting around like inert spectators while Palestinians get slaughtered in their homeland? And so I think the important thing to recognize about events such as we have been witnessing for the past 2 years is that their consequences tend to arise gradually and slowly over time and then rapidly and dramatically. I mean, to give an example, we've seen massive and growing public opposition to the policies of Western governments for their um, uh, effectively uncritical and unconditional support of Israel. And we've seen Western leaders being thoroughly and completely unresponsive to public opinion on this issue. Well, we're only now beginning to see the results in the British parliamentary elections of last year. Yes, Labour under Starmer won a clear-cut victory, but they lost 5 seats that should have been safe seats to independent candidates who effectively ran on a platform of opposition to the Labour Party's Middle East policies. Now, just yesterday, you had the stunning victory by Zohran Mamdani in the Democratic Party primary. And of course, he didn't win because of Palestine, but I think it's so telling that his opponents tried to make this primary election about into a referendum of support for Israel and lost. It's a development that I think would have been unheard of in Western electoral politics even a decade ago. And I do believe we're gradually entering an era in which embracing Israel, which used to be a no-brainer for ambitious politicians and election cycles, that Israel is increasingly becoming a liability, and at the same time, support for Palestinian determination is becoming increasingly less of a liability, in some cases, even a benefit. So just to wrap up, I think it's important to recognize we're in an era of transition, and in the nature of these things, the consequences take time and they take time to develop. And if you're talking about the Middle East, I think it's particularly important to also recognize that yes, you have this popular sentiments and popular outrage and so on, but you're dealing with an organization, sorry, rather with a region that has virtually no organization among its opposition forces. Many of them have been definitively crushed, not only over the course of the past half century or so, but particularly since 2011, 2012. And I'm quite confident that there's a lot going on beyond our field of view, under the radar and so on, that will gradually emerge. And I think a particularly interesting question is, Abed again raised the observation of the rise of Islamist forces in the Middle East after the failure of nationalist forces. Could the events of the past 2 years also be a moment in which the Islamist political project in the Middle East has run its course and will, in the coming decade or decades, give way to a new and different ideological movement that will be the standard bearer of the struggle for popular sovereignty in the Middle East?
Thank you, Mouin. Before we get to questions, Abed, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that Mouin raised some very, very important issues, and I'd encourage people to think and go back to the recording and think about them. I want to say, Jeff, that I'm possibly less pessimistic, or maybe actually I'm beyond pessimism and optimism, or I believe in being beyond those things, because I think we really need to think about these things as dynamic processes. Yes, imperialism at the moment, this is one of the moments where we can say America has bases everywhere. It should be something like equivalent to Britain's moment in the Middle East after the Second World War. You have an American moment in the Middle East, and you've had multiple American moments here. Okay. They've taken some hits. One of the biggest hits was the loss of Iran and of course after the revolution, because Iran was one of its twin pillars in the Gulf region. The other pillar being Saudi Arabia. Iran was supposed to be the muscle. Saudi Arabia was supposed to be the money. Iran was supposed to be the region's cup, by the way, the tough imperialist policeman of the region, and that got completely taken out. So things change. That was not predictable at the time, and it came out of very specific processes that were happening under the surface. However, at the moment, even Iran, and this is what this latest episode should illustrate to all of us, the current moment we're living in is where all the regional powers are actually competing to get US favor, or to at least get relief from US pressure. And this is very important to note. I hear a lot of people talking about, well, Iran is trying to liberate Palestine. Iran has done more to alleviate the pressure, or to contest something like the genocide in Gaza, than anybody else. However, was it trying to did it put all of its weight to stop the genocide? Did it bomb Tel Aviv over that? Did it bomb Israeli troops in Gaza now, for example? Did they send rockets there? They have capacity to do that. That's not what they chose to do. Okay. I'm not saying that they have no interest. Ideologically, by the way, these are very sincere people when it comes to Palestine. And I always have regular chats in the region with people who doubt the sincerity. Khomeini was expelled from Iran in 1963 for calling the Shah a new Yazid over the discovery of his relationships with Israel. He actually publicly denounced it. I mean, a mosque called him a new Yazid, which, for those that don't know Shia theology, Yazid is considered to be the equivalent to the devil in Shia theology. He's the guy that ordered the killing of Hussein, the main martyr in Shia Islam. And so, these are people that are committed. However, Iran is also a state. It is a big state. It is a regional player. It has discovered very early on that autarky is impossible in the international order. Even the Soviet Union could not pull it off. You can't break out of the international financial system. You can't break out of the international supply chain system. You can't even sell oil in a world that is desperate for oil to countries that really want to buy it from you, if you have the dominant superpower coming in and restricting your options. So, And that's why, by the way, this whole nuclear program talk, yes, I mean, we can talk about it ideologically. Of course, why does Israel have nuclear weapons? Why don't other states have nuclear weapons? Iran has a right to do that, etc., whatever, in the regional arena. But really, what Iran was doing had nothing to do with nuclear weapons at all. For those that really know about this, they know that this was the only card that they had to try to get sanctions relief. The economic situation is disastrous there. The isolation is horrific that they're facing. They got a deal with Obama that gave them some relief. They paused immediately their program. If they were interested in enrichment or continuing, and they had no interest in the money and integration to the global markets. And I'll tell you something, this is a big difference between Khamenei and Khomeini. Khamenei is actually surrounded by lots of neoliberal-minded advisors. Anybody that knows anything about Iranian politics will tell you that. And they've been saying for years, we want to be integrated into the global economy. We're suffocating in this system. There are class interests that are pushing in Iran for this. In the same way that there are class interests in the Israeli state that are not exactly too excited about the current situation. And I believe that they will have their own limited interventions. I say limited because at the end of the day, the Israeli state, there's always going to be unity over settler colonialism there. But there's a certain margin for difference over how to conduct settler colonial policy that comes out of different class interests and competing situations unfolding on the ground connected to that. So Iran was going through that process. Trump comes and terminates. Now, notice, even after everything that has happened now, when they're in a much weaker position, their most important intervention was to come and say, we still have cards on the table. We have not collapsed. We're not going to collapse. We can create major headaches for you. We can disrupt the international economy if we really want to go crazy. But we're not going crazy. We really want some level of integration. So this is happening on the one hand. Now, I feel and again, we cannot know because it's very difficult to read what's going on right now. We don't have enough data on it. We don't have documents. And it's very difficult to decipher what the current administration is doing in the US. But especially based on what's been going on for the past few days, my feeling is Trump has had major conversations in the Gulf during his previous visit and even before, in which the idea of reintegrating Iran and him making good deals out of that, and I mean for himself and for others, okay, is not off the table. So, and we saw today a couple of statements. We saw yesterday a couple of statements. They have nothing to do with the liberation of Palestine, by the way. When people get too excited and they're like, oh, Trump is opposing Israel. He hasn't said nothing about even the classic US position, which is two-state solution or anything like that. He's not actually proposing any political solution for the disaster that is unfolding, okay, in Gaza. However, he might pave the way for some kind of basic agreement with no political horizon that might stop the isolation of Iran, okay, without full, not full integration, but some openings towards that. And he might open the space for at least slowing down the genocide or having some basic relief. I don't know if he's going to agree to support what Hamas is talking about, which, by the way, is not about either a major political solution. And that indicates something. When even Hamas is not talking about a political solution, they're not saying Palestinian independence, they're not saying any, which is usually their line. Now, by the way, Khalil Nuno, their spokesperson today, said that Hamas will not accept one of four points. Stopping the war and the attack completely on Gaza, full withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, okay, reconstruction and ending the siege, and an exchange agreement for prisoners, both Palestinian and Israeli. Notice here, they're not talking about sovereign Palestinian state. They're not talking about national liberation. They're not talking about the full, they're not talking about one state, two state, any state. They're not talking about what's the horizon. It's within these limits, which means this is at the moment the level we're operating at when it comes to the Palestinian cause. So we have to be able to read this complex terrain, both in terms of what the regional states are doing, including Iran, and what their interests dictate at this moment. And then from the Palestinian lens, we have to look at what's being talked about and what's not being talked about, both by Palestinians and by everybody else. One thing I will note, Jeff, we were in the Gaza tribunal together. One subject of discussion amongst all the Palestinians that were there, we went out for a nice, dinner, and we were talking. And what kept coming up is the genocide has produced a transformation of the sort that Mouin is saying, a transformation in global consciousness. It's going to really damage the main, actually, then this is, I'll end on this note. This is a more hopeful note. It's going to end, the main axiom upon which the entire Israeli project is built is support from the West. And we've seen this, actually, this is another thing that this war has demolished, which is this myth that Israel can act on its own. I've heard it a million times, and it always bothered me. I'm sure Mouin is always pissed off whenever he hears this. When people come and tell you, well, Israel is so technologically advanced. It has its own military industry. It can do whatever it wants. This, it's no longer dependent on the United States. I've been hearing this trope for maybe 20 years plus. Jeff, I'm sure you hear it as well.
Mm.
Total male cow droppings. Totally. There's nothing, no truth to it. They can't last for more than 12 days without being resupplied with rockets. And even the 12 days they lasted required heavy investment from the world's biggest superpower. It's very expensive, this stuff. No small state can actually do it alone that way. And it is a small state. It will always be a small state, both in terms of a strategic depth, which is why it always tries to expand its frontiers, but also in terms of its human resources and economic resources, no matter how much they talk about economic miracles and so on. So this transformation in consciousness is making them lose. We've seen now a democratic primary being won by a Muslim person who is very pro-Palestinian and openly so in New York City, with a lot of Jewish young voters voting for him. That tells you something. Half of his staff is Jewish staff also. And they're there. You know why they're there? Partly because there's a lot of progressive Jews, but also because the genocide has created a transformation in Jewish life, certainly amongst those sections of American Jewry that were not on the, let's say, radical left, but were on the kind of, general left, mainstream left. The radical left was always with Palestine, but the mainstream left, your average kind of, I want good healthcare and schools for people, that was not actually fully resolved on this issue. They were uncomfortable around Israel, but now they know exactly what it's about. And actually, they want to be part of the process of Palestinian liberation. And I'm seeing this. This is producing very good comradeship, by the way. I'm liking this. I've gained so many new comrades and friends and sisters and brothers over the past couple of years. People who've had a genuine transformation cannot stand this genocide and everything that has produced it. Netanyahu knows this. He wants to maximize whatever he can, the capitalization on whatever he can get at this moment, because they feel like I have to therefore create new facts on the ground and use new Middle East because of this reality. And at the same time, he wants to ensure one more thing, and this is what we were talking about in Sarajevo in the tribunal, he wants to ensure that there's no one to harvest on the Palestinian side. And when Kissinger said, before he died, one of his last interventions was a really, really sick intervention, but it tells you everything, because he was, in a way, an architect of all of this, bypassing Palestinians through the Arab state system, all of this. That was his so-called shuttle of diplomacy. It was all about that. You know what his comment was after October 7th? He was like, they must not be allowed a seat at the table. That has been his position on Palestinians from day one. They should be out of the table. You cannot have somebody that can harvest even after this genocide, anything that could lead to liberation. So this is the challenge that we have to deal with, and I'm going to stop here because I know people have lots of questions.
Thank you, Abed. No, there are a lot of questions, and actually we're right at the beginning of the discussion. But we've kind of run out of time. Linda, do we have time for maybe one question for each, or I know it's
Yes, it's going to depend how long the answers take, but definitely let's start with a question to each of our speakers. Stephen, can you pose one now, please?
Yes, thank you. Amazing presentations. Thank you to our speakers. David Finkel has asked a question. Israel's goals of expulsion and ethnic cleansing of Palestine are pretty clear. What do the panelists think are the US's regional goals that may not be so obvious?
Mouin?
Well, I don't think, despite Trump's harebrained Gaza Riviera scheme, I don't think the mass expulsion of Palestinians is a US policy objective. Rather, I think it's one of these situations where Palestine is considered insignificant in Washington compared to the other regional issues, and therefore dealing with it is delegated to Israel. This is not this is not a question on which the United States and Israel have fundamental differences because of a clear divergence of policy or national security objectives. And I think that's how we should understand Israel consistently being allowed to have its way with the Palestinians with total impunity as far as Washington and the Europeans are concerned. Clearly, ethnic cleansing is a strategic objective for Israel. And I think there was a real risk that if the war with Iran expanded into a regional war with global ramifications, that under cover of that, Israel would have felt sufficiently confident to expel the Palestinians, certainly from the Gaza Strip, probably from the West Bank, and potentially even Palestinian citizens of Israel en masse. I think we've avoided that. And I think that Israel's objective now is to create a situation akin to that which you had in Syria during its war, where people are not being expelled in an organized fashion, but seek to leave in any way they can in order to save their lives and ensure a future for their children and so on. Of course, the difference here is that for Palestinians, leaving is an act fraught with political consequences, and they will be leaving in the knowledge that they will be prohibited from returning. As far as U.S. policy objectives in the region are concerned, I think it sees this primarily as a region of massive economic consequence for two reasons. First of all, because of the huge surpluses generated by energy sales, in other words, the recycling of petrodollars. And second of all, even though we're now in a situation where the US no longer imports oil from the Middle East, its rivals import virtually all of their oil from the Middle East. And secondly, of course, the price of oil is not determined locally, but globally. So if a crisis in the Middle East pushes the price of oil through the stratosphere, Americans in Wyoming filling up their car with oil from Texas or Oklahoma will feel the impact. Will feel the impact of that as well. So that's why I think it is a region of enormous strategic consequence to the United States. And secondly, I think also, the traditional policy that Abid spoke about of you have to ensure that there is no popular sovereignty in the Middle East. First of all, because of the threat this could have for the policy objectives I just spoke, and second of all, because you know if one person achieves freedom, next thing you know, everyone else will be trying to achieve freedom. So I think that's an important policy objective as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Simon, do you have a question, please, for Abid?
Yes, I do. I'm going to massively paraphrase Bob Hervest's question. Is Israel achieving total regional dominance, or is there a serious counterforce emerging?
Well, I think what's happening now is multiple things. I mean, I'm going to go back to the imperial arena because I think that's what matters the most. I know that Mouin has mentioned that Palestine is not significant enough, but I do think it's significant actually as enough to be the main subject of discussion in a presidential debate, in any congressional campaign. There's massive money that gets raised around it. Actually, it's one of the biggest arenas for raising money, and money in American politics is very important. Zionism in America is a social and political movement. And yes, they might not be talking about Palestine, but when you're talking about Israel, you're talking about Palestine. So that is just the elephant in the room, because anything relating to Israel will have repercussions for Palestine. So Palestine is important because actually it's at the heart of everything relating to Israel. And the Israelis always try to pretend like it's irrelevant because they have to. If you're going to push the policy of destroying the Palestinian people, you have to say they don't matter. Let them disappear. Okay. But by spending so much energy and time on it, of course, it's central to the discussion. The new development that is happening now is that this is coming out to the fore. And we've seen this in MAGA. They're sick and tired of this whole Israel mythology of Israel as a strategic asset. By the way, as a historian, I completely reject it. As a historian of the Gulf, not a single empire needed Israel to set up the whole Gulf infrastructure. The British certainly did not. Actually, every British policy paper in the time when they were setting up the settler colonial project in Palestine, the government of India, which was running the Gulf, was pissed off. They were like, this is bad for us in India. It's bad for us in the Gulf. We hate it. It's causing too much contestation politically. It's causing unrest. It's causing unnecessary extra damage. Of course, they were powerful enough to be able to continue their project, regardless of things like Palestine. But Palestine added costs. It was a major distraction. It actually really weakened Gulf regimes for a while in their battle with Nasser. It cost them, and it was also not popular amongst their ranks. People like King Faisal really, really hated Zionism. He was pissed off at the whole thing. And sometimes, you have leftist Arabs trying to question that, being like, no, he was a traitor and whatever on this. I'm like, no, he was just a royal who was acting in his own interest. He was not going to throw his throne for Palestine. But he wasn't a fan of Zionism, and he really felt really bad around it. The ideational aspect was important. Now, you have a new generation that doesn't care as much for many ideological reasons. MBS is not King Faisal. It's not even King Faisal's son, who has spoken very forcefully in recent years and has been consistent around this. Turkey al-Faisal, for example. And certainly MBZ is not Sheikh Zayed, and that partly has to do with something that not many people know about, which I was referring to, which is the competition over empire. The main problem that we have in the region now is that the US is so dominant that every state wants to maximize its direct access to it. And for the entirety of the first few decades of post-independence from Britain, all of the regional states in the Gulf had to access the US through Saudi Arabia. That was the main base. The US gave it the most respect. There was no other line. If you're the Emirates, if you're Oman, if you're any state, the main interlocutor with the United States of America in this region is Saudi Arabia. Now, there were major transformations that took place, especially after the September 11 and the Iraq War, that caused changes in that. The Saudis could no longer have bases in Saudi Arabia at the same scale that they had before. They had to, which meant that they had to rely on US bases being built elsewhere. That gave an original opening. Later on, you had also new ambitious rulers figuring out that if you talk to the Israelis in Washington, they will open doors for you. And if you have a crisis with the Saudis or with another Gulf state, you can utilize the Israelis they will offer their services actually to improve your position. And I'm going to give you one example. Netanyahu's first visit to the Gulf in the past decade happened in Oman. That was at a time when Saudi-Omani relations were at their worst, because Oman had refused to participate in Saudi's campaign against Qatar. And the Saudis had actually built a whole network of roads that was very strategic, the Duqm project, to bypass Dubai. There's a whole logistical project to the Indian Ocean. We can talk about, by the way, the logistics around this and the energy lines. And, it's a very complicated discussion. But they were willing, the Saudis were putting pressure on even that. They closed that road. They were willing to put so much pressure, and there were rumors of troops mobilizations on the Omani border akin to the ones that they had on Qatar. First thing that Qaboos does before, this was just before he died, let's invite Netanyahu over. Kushner calls the Saudis, is like, stop any moves against Oman, back off. So they discovered that there's a utility to this relationship here in some of these minor arenas that might look minor to us, but they're not that minor to them. Internal regional competition is important. Some economic gains are important. So there's that going on. But the umbilical cord now is under threat. And that's why I have to bring this back to the United States. There's changes now where people are figuring out that Israel is not actually as good of an ally or as useful of an asset or even acting properly as a proxy. I mean, I hate to use foul language here, but I've been following some of the MAGA people. They were even initially, when Trump participated in this campaign, they were saying things like Trump is Netanyahu's BIT, dot. It's like this kind of language coming in, is a very new phenomena in American politics now around the Israeli state on this level. For Tucker Carlson and all these people to come out this way, that have realized and they're beginning to see that Israel has put all of its political capital in Washington for many decades towards this regime change project that ultimately may or may not have been actually really useful for the American empire. Most probably it was not. This was not, by the way, the original project of post-Cold War drafting the rules that Baker had, for example. And I know this well because the undersecretary at the time is somebody that I know quite well. He was the director of the Baker Institute. And we spoke a lot about it. They had a vision. It was an imperialist vision. George Bush had an imperialist vision. His administration did. They were trying to create the world after the Cold War. But their regional formula was quite different than the regional formula that Clinton and co brought in, with the entry of massive numbers of Israeli and pro-Israeli forces and characters and figures into the main key decision-making centers of the U.S. State. And that makes a difference. Because I'll tell you something, yes, we speak often of, when we talk of national strategy and national interest and so on, there is the national interest in the abstract sense. If you can put like a very good analyst like Mouin, for example, or Jeff in a room, and they come and think, okay, what are our interests in a pure sense? There's energy, there's this amount of money, there's this situation with China, the big balance of power questions, the big geopolitical questions, the big money questions. Okay, the grand strategy questions, as they call them in this field, the chessboard. Okay, but there's also something else, which is the construction of what is national interest. And that happens in situations like Israel, where you have to spend billions of dollars every year to convince people that there's national interest. Saudi Arabia does not need to spend a single penny to convince any American planner that there's national interest relating to Saudi Arabia, because that's a big pot of oil there. Israel has to do a lot of work to come and say, oh, we are the national interest. And now you have the MAGA type saying, no, you're not. And actually, you're harming us. You have the left coming and saying, you're settler colonial and you're no good. It's still the far left, but it's spreading in other circles. The problem is, will this translate into transformation in the mainstream? We have to wait and see.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Jeff, I'm going to call on you just for a very, very brief summary and closing, and then I've got some announcements I'll skip through. So Jeff, back to you. Is that okay?
Sure. First of all, thank you to Mouin and Abed for this. It's I think this is something that ICAHD has always been trying to do, is really bring in an analysis to what's happening. I mean, I think there's a certain disconnect between the academic world with its analysis and the world that, that mobilizes around Palestinians that aren't necessarily academics and don't read the journals and the books, but really need that. In other words, we need both of those things put together. And I think tonight was a great example of, of the depth. I mean, like I said, I think we're just at the very cusp of a beginning of a conversation, after an hour and a half or more. I guess my one of my motivations for partly initiating this and determining what we're talking about is the part of where are we headed. And I guess, it's too bad we don't have more time to kind of unpack this, because I still think that the question of where could the progressive forces being, I think it's true, certainly what Abed is saying, especially that Palestine has become an issue at the level of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, where entire generations of people are really involved. And I think you have all of that, but then the question becomes, okay, well, how can that mobilization that exists? I guess what my problem here is working with the Palestinians is that this has to be in Palestine, certainly a Palestinian-led struggle, and there's the human rights part of the struggle and the international law part is very well developed for the Palestinians. The activists is a huge activist community all over the world. And you have academics, that are involved from the point of view of writing a lot about it and being interviewed and so on. The Dig as an example again. But what's missing is the political part. And the BDS is very developed. But there's a whole political part that's missing. There is no political program. That's what I'm trying to push our One Democratic State campaign about. This is the only group, a Palestinian-led group, that has actually developed a 10-point political program, a very solid basis for a discussion of where we could move forward, because the mobilization might exist around the world, but nobody can represent the Palestinians. And unless there's a Palestinian voice that says, this is where we're going, this is your marching orders, this is what we want you to advocate for, the mobilization is there, but in a sense it's limited, or the people are stuck because they can't advocate, before the Palestinians. And so I guess, what we still have to talk about more is how those kinds of openings can be made and developed. How can we empower the grassroots? And then that becomes, of course, a wider Middle Eastern issue, because these autocratic regimes, around the world are certainly suppressing the Arab peoples. I mean, that's where you have that huge divide. I think there's, the Arab street is super mobilized around Palestine, but it has no tangible expression because, like Abed says, of the government repression. And the repression has to do both with the Palestinian issue, in my view, partly because they're trying to curry favor with the United States and Europe and so on, these governments, but also because, like Mouin said, the danger that they pose to the regimes themselves. So I guess I'm still, maybe we have to have a part two.
Yes.
Still want to explore more of this idea of, okay, how can the progressive forces in the region, together with progressive forces around the world that support the Palestinian struggle, what do we have to do to mobilize in order to try to create a meaningful counterforce to everything that we've been talking about tonight? So
Excellent. Thanks, Jeff. And I echo everything Jeff has said. It's been fabulous to have you with us, Mouin Rabbani and Abdel Takriti. I do want to just bring up 3 slides very, very quickly that we're going to.
Linda, do you mind if we leave before that, because unless we need it for those slides?
No, it's just 2 or 3 minutes. It's just 2 or 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Abed.
Well, it's been a total pleasure, and I'm very grateful to you, Linda, and Jeff, and to everybody here. Really, I mean, it's been fantastic, and I apologize for not leaving enough space for more questions.
Well, we just have to continue our engagement.
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate today. It was also great having the opportunity to speak together with Abed.
Okay, thank you.
Always an honor.
Really, really great. Okay.
Very much. And it's, yes.
Oh, you're dismissed. Class dismissed.
Yes, class dismissed.
Goodbye.
A conversation.
Okay, thanks.
I hope we can continue, because it's very important for ICAHD to work strategically. So we're not about activity for activity's sake. We seek to be really strategic. If you aren't already engaged with ICAHD, please learn more about us. So we've got our support chapters in the UK, the US, and Germany, and elevating Jeff's voice and what's happening on the ground. We have a website, which is a fantastic resource with materials that go back to its founding, 1997. It's always updated. We're about to bring out a new website as well. So come to us, follow us, engage with us, get our newsletters, reports, action bulletins, and so forth. So go to the website to sign up for those things. Because we're political, we are not humanitarian, we're not a charity. We really need your support, please, for our ongoing work. Next slide. Our next slide is about our forthcoming webinar, which will be on Tuesday, the 15th of July, and the timings are there. And the theme is Human Rights Defenders Standing Up Against Settler Terrorism. Our speakers will be Rabbi Eric Asherman, who is working with Protective Presence, northeast of Jerusalem, going out protecting Palestinian shepherds. Also speaking will be Isa Amro from Youth Against Settlements in Hebron. And he is been nominated, along with Jeff, for this year's Nobel Peace Prize. So come to our website, sign up for those, for that next webinar, please. And then the final slide. Just wanted to mention again that we provide study tours to Palestine, Israel. The next tour is going to be in November, and Palestinians need us. They feel abandoned by the world on the ground, and to actually be there demonstrating our solidarity is extremely meaningful. And it also means that participants return home with far more in-depth understanding of what's happening, which really strengthens their campaign, which is all part of the movement now to change history in Israel-Palestine. So I want to thank you all for coming, for your patience. It's been a much longer webinar than we normally have. I hope you understand why, the depth of information that's needed to be shared. Let's keep in touch. So thanks again for everybody who helped facilitate the webinar this evening, and for you all for coming. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you all for participating.